Okay, so we are on video 3 and we're on a different PowerPoint now on TSCA, which is the Toxic Substance Control Act from 1976. So TSCA is different. A lot of what we've dealt with before is, cleanup and management of pollution that's existing. TSCA is meant to curb the manufacture of dangerous chemicals before they're actually even ever manufactured. So this was one of the administrators of the EPA in 1975 was testifying, saying, we need legislation to prevent these dangerous chemicals being produced. Okay, so this is rather than, there is disposable, but the manufacture and processing of what we call regulated chemicals. Okay, so what are manufacturers? Those who produce, prepare, import, or compound a toxic chemical. So, what happens in TSCA? They, if they are anticipating manufacturing a chemical, they have to apply. They call it a pre-manufacture notice when they're manufacturing a chemical that is not already known. And they have to conduct testing as part of that pre-manufacture notice to see if they're allowed to do it. So one of the things, I'm not sure what slide this is on, that we're going to talk about is this TSCA inventory. Okay, and then they have to avoid manufacturing certain chemicals called PCBs, and they have to maintain records. And if there's inspections, they have to be ready to be inspected by the EPA and demonstrate compliance. Okay. So if a company is planning on making a new substance, they apply pre-manufacture notice. Okay. And this is only for manufacturers of chemicals for commercial purposes. So if we are with our little chemistry set in our house, we don't have to worry about pre-manufacturer notices. Okay. So a processor, they're preparing a chemical substance and they're going to distribute it in commerce and as part whatever. You're making a chemical to sell commercially. Okay, so they have to give the EPA the data that comes out of these testing that they have conducted. If they are processing the same chemical but for a significant new use, they have to notify them. And any EPA orders and rules, and avoid processing PCBs. So PCBs, it's like not it's a category of chemicals that was used as a lubricant for like manufacturing equipment, and it was found to be like extremely carcinogenic. And it's just like one of the few categories of chemicals that it's just banned. Using it as banned these days. So there's some that are they're existing, but really you can't make PCBs anymore. You have to comply with reporting requirements. They call that the Comprehensive Assessment Information Rule, CAIR. And if there are any requests for inspections, they have to respond to those from the EPA. This is our CARI. They have to, it's a record keeping and reporting requirement under TSCA. Okay, so we have that's, they're not, the users aren't defined, but anyone who is using one of these chemicals has to comply with the regulations. They can't use PCBs unless specifically permitted by the EPA. Can't use any chemical substance that isn't complying with TSCA. And of course, if there's any request for information or inspection by the EPA, they have to comply with that as well. Okay, distributors, the ones who are selling or distributing the chemical in commerce, and they have to, again, refrain from distributing PCBs. If there's any substantial risk information, they have to report and then comply with inspection and stuff by the EPA. Disposers, similar stuff, right? Any regs, dispose of, if you have PCBs, they have to dispose of them properly and be available for inspection. Okay, so the TSCA inventory. So there's a list kept by the EPA. You can download it at that link there. Just a big long list of chemicals, which is around since the creation of TSCA in 1976. And it's all chemicals that are in commerce. Okay, there's over 80,000 of them. So new and existing chemicals. And this list, it's kept online because it is constantly changing, right? Because people are like if they're no longer manufacturing them, it gets off the list. If there's new chemicals, they add. And then, when we get this pre-manufacturer notice, it goes on the TSCA inventory. So anything, right? Anything, chemical substances manufactured, imported, or processed for commercial purposes in the U.S. that is for some reason not excluded from the TSCA inventory. Okay, so here's a list of exclusions like mixtures, tobaccos, itty bitty quantities that you're not manufacturing it for commercial use. You're just using it for research and development. Pesticides are excluded from the TSCA inventory because they are controlled by FIFRA. So some other ones, some technical stuff. Okay. It's constantly changing because we have new pre-manufacturing notice. You can delist. You can request to delist if if it's no longer hazardous. Every 4 years, you have to update information. So that's your update rule. And again, if there's anything that you find from the original PMN that is wrong, you have a duty to follow up and correct anything that you've submitted to the EPA under TSCA. Okay, so your pre-manufacturer notice is required for chemicals that aren't on the TSCA inventory, or it's one of these significant new uses, right? That's the significant new use rule, or SNUR. Okay, and what's the chemical, right? The chemical properties, how it's used, amounts, potential byproducts, what happens when employees are exposed, how do you dispose of it, and this the test data is super important under TSCA, how this chemical, they test on how this chemical will affect human health and the environment. So that's in your PMN. Okay. Oh, I think we just talked about this. Mixtures, pesticide, right? Things that are exempt from the PMN requirements, chemicals with no risk. This test market exception. So that's kind of on the R&D thing. If you're doing just a little bit of a testing on it, if there's no risk under that activity. Polymers, and like very similar to this test market exemption, this LVE, a low volume exception. If we're only producing this in an itty bitty volume, you don't have to file a PMN. So one interesting example as an exemption from the TSCA, the pre-manufacturer notice requirement, is the Polaroid exemption. So you guys, I think that this has kind of become a thing again. We used to have these Instamatic cameras, right, where you take a picture and then it develops instantly, right? I think they have newer versions of this now, but Polaroid was a photography company, and they wanted to be able to use these new chemicals for this instant photo technology, like right away. And they filed a notice for an exemption, and the EPA actually put out regulations giving them special permission to use these chemicals, and they never had to do a PMN. So this is like a permanently codified request to get special treatment. So it's just an example of influence for big business, and that is the subject of our discussion board. So I'll pause this one, and you guys can go work on your discussion board and come back for the last video.